I have been asked this question from parents and from colleagues. Is this autism? And this question is more often asked when we are talking about girls. So I wanted to have a conversation about autistic girls and about understanding the less obvious presentations of autism. Many autistic youth feel misunderstood, and research shows that being autistic leads to increased risk for a host of mental health issues, anxiety, depression, suicide, and other adverse life events. For many, an accurate diagnosis can be life-changing. But it's not enough to uncover a diagnosis. In fact, it's not the goal. The goal is to understand struggles, identify strengths, and provide the individual, their family, with appropriate tools, strategies, and support moving forward. Today, my guest is Dr. Megan Beardmore, a licensed school psychologist with expertise in assessment and treatment of young children and young adults with autism spectrum disorder and related neurodevelopmental disorders. This is an important conversation, and I'm glad you're joining us.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Good morning, Dr. Beardmore. Thanks for joining me.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
I'm really thrilled that you're here. I really appreciated the talk you gave to our Child Nexus community of professionals a while back. And I knew, we talked about it and I thought, this will be a great topic for the podcast as well, because it's coming up for a lot of parents and a lot of professionals who work with autistic girls. And so I am so happy that we are having this conversation because I think it's an important one.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Yeah. So today we're talking about autistic girls, and I'm using identity first language because many autistic individuals see autism as part of their identity and not a medical disorder. So for people who are listening, because I know that we are both trained very differently and sometimes it kind of slips in. But so I'm going to be very purposeful about using that language. But sometimes it kind of sleeps in, and I just want to make sure that it's not to offend anyone.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Dr. Beardmore, over the past few decades, the prevalence of autism has risen. I remember when it was 1 in 150, and now it's 1 in 44. I think the last time I checked, 1 in 44. And it seems like this is in part due to the fact that we are more sophisticated at identifying individuals who exhibit these autistic traits. But is there something else going on? And we can specifically talk about girls, but that is allowing us to really identify autistic individuals, autistic youth, more of them.
Yes. It's a great first question because it's a big one. I think from a practical standpoint, thinking about how the DSM took away the Asperger's diagnosis is, important for us to remember, because essentially we're saying that autism spectrum is capturing a much broader spectrum, right? So we're catching folks that are on that, higher end or higher functioning, or kids and adults who are, masking a little bit, I guess I could say better. So they're out in the world, I'm getting a lot of first diagnoses for people who are also older. So you can kind of see how back in the 90s, that rate was so much higher. And then I'm finding people in their 30s, 40s who are now meeting criteria. And I also have to thank the neurodivergent community for speaking out, and things like social media and TikTok and all of these things have really brought a lot of awareness, I think, to this current generation who has access to that information.
And I completely agree with you. And it seems like we now are realizing that there are less obvious external presentations of autism. And it is, like you said, it's a spectrum. And I agree with you. Social media has allowed autistic individuals to come forward and say, I am autistic and this is what I look like. And sometimes that's not the preconceived notions about autism. And then what happens, and I've seen this because of the calls that we get to our practice, is we'll get, like you said, young adults saying, I think I am autistic. I want to get an evaluation. Now, girls are usually diagnosed about 2 years later than boys, even if they have the same traits. Can you talk a little bit about why that might be? Because, I feel, and we've had a lot of conversations with other professionals are feeling that girls are often misdiagnosed, and then that means they're also misunderstood.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think, so when we think about autism, we're looking at a couple different things. We're looking at social communication. We are looking at, so that's just kind of like a language and communication, I should say. And then the social interaction piece. And then we have restricted repetitive behaviors. And for whatever reason, and there's not a lot of research on this yet, or the research that we have is kind of conflicting. But that restricted repetitive behaviors seems to be just less obvious with girls. So I could give you an example, like say, there was one time I evaluated a young girl who had said, I was really into horses. And I eventually figured out that that wasn't cool, that kids laughed at me one time. And so I decided to, kind of keep that to myself. Or, their fixed interests can be things that are more socially acceptable. They don't get in the way. I think I could say a classic one that I've seen before is, I have an interest in vacuums. That one is pretty obvious. That stands out. That's not going to have a lot of social utility. Whereas for females, for whatever reason, there seems to just, it blends in a little bit better. So there's that component. But then I also think, with regard to the first two categories I mentioned, so communication and social interactions, there's more masking. And I guess it's probably time I talk about masking a little bit, where there is, or social camouflaging, we could call it, where females tend to have a little more social savviness, I guess you could say. I hear a lot of times from parents that we take our kid to school and our daughter will just stand back and observe, see what's going on, figure out the social gymnastics, and then enter the situation. So there's something happening. And again, I'm using a lot of blanket statements here, but these are just things that I have been told by parents and by folks that I've evaluated.
Right. And I think it's really important to be in tune to the autistic community about their experience, because oftentimes, we look at autistic individuals, and autism doesn't merely consist of behaviors that other people can see. And so what you're talking about, this masking and this camouflaging, it seems like there's tremendous effort and exhaustion involved in behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, we think about it as it's a double-edged sword, right? It gets you by, but then by the time, women are in, high school and college, and they're starting to have more, developed relationships, intimate relationships, and those kinds of things, that threshold for being able to kind of keep up starts to, we're chasing after it. And I get a lot of referrals that are, actually about internalizing symptoms. So depression, anxiety. So yeah, the social camouflaging works until it doesn't. And then we want to make sure that that's the part where we're intervening.
Right. And it seems that for girls, that's even more impactful, because girls tend to be more social beings. I think about the fact that they're diagnosed, a couple years later. And oftentimes that's right around that middle school, fourth grade, maybe even before middle school, like that fourth grade, fifth grade. But the quality of social relationships also changes drastically during that time. So it seems like girls can kind of fly under the radar if they're at birthday parties and they're at a trampoline park and everybody's doing the same thing. But then those social nuances change right around third and fourth grade.
Yes, I couldn't agree more, right? It's like, what social group do I fall into now? There's cliques and there's all these higher order relational things happening.
Right. And it sounds like it's managing those social relationships that is problematic and challenging for autistic girls, more so than their peers.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so what does that look like? So when girls are camouflaging, can you give some examples? Because there might be parents listening or even practitioners who are working with autistic girls. Or a girl who maybe has not been identified as autistic yet. What can that look like? Or what is the narrative that autistic girls are sharing about that experience?
I appreciate that question. I feel like I have a bank of statements that have really stood out to me. And it happens a lot when I'm doing the ADOS. So when I'm evaluating autism, there are these questions that elicit the sentiment. Because I think after I say these, it's going to be like, well, then the question becomes, how do we as parents, as lay people, try to, assess this or figure what's going on. So I get a sentiment a lot of, I get it, but I don't. Like something feels off and I can't name it. So I ask questions about how well do you fit in with your same age peers, and the key word is same age peers. And I will often get this sort of I feel like I'm faking it. There's something, but they're not able to kind of put their finger on it. And that's really, really stressful. So this idea that something isn't clicking can happen. Feeling like people don't understand me is another one I get. Whatever my interests are, the way that I think, the way that I learn, the way I communicate, people are not meeting me at I could go on and on.
Those are really great examples, because I think examples really shed light on, the experience of the autistic person, of the autistic child, because it's not always clear on what that is, because, I remember a lot of clinicians would say, they can't have autism because they make good eye contact. Well, an autistic person can make good eye contact. They can have a sense of humor. They can be socially motivated, but still struggle.
Yes, absolutely. And for the record, I should say it's rare that I code poor eye contact when I'm doing ADOS with, school age kids, because you figure out that's what I'm supposed to do. Think about how many times a teacher would have to say, look at me, so I know you're listening. But yeah, I think overall there's just the sentiment of something's off, and not really sure what that is. So there's a distinction between, self-awareness. So a lot of times kids and young adults understand, well, I know it's something, but then in relation to someone else, that perspective taking that well, I don't really know what they're thinking and feeling. I don't really know if I'm their friend. How am I supposed to figure that out? So I don't know if I'm making sense with that. There's a good self-awareness usually, but then again, awareness of self within a relationship.
Right. And I think that's a really good point. It's understanding, we talk quite a bit about being able to understand someone else's intentions, right? Or understand and we often do that. We take it for granted that we can kind of assume what someone is thinking based on their body language, based on their tone of voice. But that's harder for autistic individuals to kind of pick up on those nuances.
Absolutely. Talking about social cognition, that I can pick up. I often have girls who will say I'm so hyper aware of what people's faces are doing, right? Because I'm trying to figure it out. Just the other day, I had somebody come in who had said that, I'm looking for social feedback, even when I'm walking in the halls. I'm just trying to check in, see if, did I do something wrong? How do I look? There's always that looking and checking in. That, for example, body language and facial cues are what we are supposed to attend to as social beings in order to figure out what someone is thinking and feeling, right? So there's awareness of I'm supposed to do that, but then what happens is, well, what does that mean? How do I change my behavior based on the information I'm getting?
That's a really good point. Like, what do I do with that information? So I see it, I recognize it, but what do I do with that information? And, I've had parents say, she can't be autistic because she has a lot of empathy. And I think there's this misconception that autistic individuals don't show empathy. And that's not true.
Oh, that one is such a sticky, I feel very passionate about that one. So it comes from, and it's important to address like why we think that. Simon Baron-Cohen was the guy who sort of came up with this idea that this whole perspective taking is awry, and therefore, if I can't, read someone's mind, then I must not have empathy, because that can happen, right? If you can't figure out how someone's thinking and feeling, it's going to be hard to show empathy. But what we are finding in the literature now on empathic attunement is telling us that we can catch each other's emotions. It's not that we lack the empathy. It's what do we do with that information? That information can be very overwhelming for a person with autism. And so it's about, how do I sort out, how do I regulate my nervous system? There's just so much, it's like an information overload. But the idea now is there's not a lack of empathy. It's I'm getting that information. I'm trying to figure out what to do with that.
Right. It's almost like they get flooded with other people's emotions, and then they can't make sense of it. And it can cause people to shut down, because when people feel overwhelmed, you just want to distance yourself. You don't want to have that overwhelming feeling. And if you don't know how to address it, you just kind of shut down or walk away. And that can look like, lacking empathy.
Totally. When really it's, I see you, I hear you, I'm struggling, I don't know.
Right. What I'm supposed to do. Hey friends, it's Karen Wilson. We're taking a quick break to make sure that you know that I'm opening up opportunities to hop on a 45-minute one-on-one Zoom with me for a consultation about your child. I do this work to provide information and tools to parents so that they can better understand their kids, feel equipped to support them at home, and advocate for them at school. Last year, I met with TJ, and he emailed me after a consultation and wrote, "I appreciate the recommendations along with the resources you provided. Really, I can't thank you enough. I believe you've set me on the path I've been looking for." Another parent said he was relaying what I said to some other parents at his kid's school, which is completely fine with me. So if you're interested in hopping on a Zoom with me, go to www.childnexus.com/consultation, and we'll set up a time to talk. Now back to the podcast. So you talked about some of the traits, and for people who make it the diagnosis, the symptoms of autism. And I love the way you describe some of the social difficulties that autistic individuals describe in their daily lives. There's also inflexibility and restricted interests that you talked about. And you tied in the idea of camouflaging and masking, and how people can kind of fall under the radar with those things because some of those interests can be accepted. I think about anime as a popular one, right? Now, the inflexibility, the kind of repetitiveness, or this what we call stereotypical behaviors, how can that look different in girls than in boys? How could that show up?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Thank you for mentioning just the rigidities and change and things like that. It seems a little more covert. I think that's my blanket statement for this. So I will often have females tell me that, oh, okay, well, the plan changed on me, or there was a surprise, or there was something unexpected that happened. I internalized that distress. I didn't show it because I knew that wouldn't be the right thing to do. Whereas parents of boys will say they have tantrums, they're freaking out, it's much more externalized. So that distress, and we know just gender differences in general, females tend to have more internalizing symptoms. And when I say internalizing, I should broaden that to say I'm talking about anxiety, worrying, low mood, and things like that. So when change or rigidities happen, there tends to be a distress that becomes internalized rather than making it known.
Right. And so that's the changes in the routine that can create that stress. And it seems like the camouflaging and the masking that you talked about can also, have its own stressor associated, because it's almost, when you say, I think you mentioned like pretending to get it. It's like pretending to be someone else a great deal of the time, or someone that you're not. It seems like that would also create its own stressors and contribute to some of the internalizing that you're talking about.
Because you can only do that for so long, right? You eventually run out of steam, and yeah.
Yeah. And I know that we're talking about girls, autistic girls, and the fact that they sometimes have a less obvious presentation of autism, but that less obvious presentation can also apply to, across the gender spectrum, right? And even to people of color. And there's this under-identification of individuals, particularly those who have high, what we call intellectual functioning, who have these high skills at problem solving and conceptualization, and they're more likely to fly under the radar regardless of gender.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely right. Absolutely right. They're protective factors, right? We could call them that. So you have more of that ability to kind of, and I should say too, and always going back to the research, there's not a lot of information on how cognitive functioning plays into gender differences in autism and things like that. But I think we could say reasonably so that for high achieving kids, or kids that, have that a little bit more aptitude, you can figure out a lot of things. You can reason very well in the social world and kind of put the blank puzzle pieces together, and you kind of like, okay, well, I get the gist, right? It's kind of like, when you're not fluent in another language, but you get by, is kind of how I see that.
Right. And I think it's really important to talk about the fact that, what that experience is like for autistic individuals to kind of get by, because it's like you said, you're kind of faking it, but you really don't get it. And maybe that's why they start questioning that something else is going on. You also mentioned internalizing, which I think is such an important factor to kind of think about, because there are significant numbers of undiagnosed autistic individuals who do present initially with anxiety and with depression and with, suicide ideation. And that's important to kind of recognize that might be the preliminary or the primary symptom that shows up in some of these girls, and the need to address that.
Yes. I mean, it's happened a lot. Both of us are in a practice where we get lots of different referrals for assessment, and then we end up saying, hey, wait a minute, everything that we're doing, and we do very robust, I know both, your practice and ours, we're really trying to get a sense of everything. And then, we're left with this like, but why? What is explaining what's underlying these internalizing symptoms? And when you do a little bit more digging, not always, but sometimes when I'm doing these evaluations, we'll find that it's about belonging.
Mm-hmm.
When you think about low mood and belonging, they go together.
Absolutely.
You don't have to work. If you are struggling with that, it's going to stress you out and it's going to bring you down.
That is so true. And it's such an important piece, that belonging piece, because we know that belonging is tied to just general well-being and a sense of where you fit in the world and a sense of self. And it strikes me that a person who is camouflaging and masking for a great deal of their lives doesn't get to develop that sense of self, of who they really are as a person.
Right. Right. And there's plenty of outcome studies that suggest exactly what you're saying. That is absolutely demonstrated. So there's this feeling of, well, really, who am I? Because like you're saying, that sense of awareness, that all of that develops before usually there's that like, oh, wait, I might have an autism diagnosis. So there's, and usually what happens after a diagnosis, and I love studies that go back and interview folks who receive the diagnosis, and they can say, okay, now I feel like I have the space to really explore who I am. I can retain my sense of self while wanting to have connections with other people. They get the intervention. So there's all sorts of really great things that happen after the diagnosis, even if it initially is not something we were, thinking about or didn't have on the radar initially.
Right. And I would love for you to talk about that, because I think, there are parents who say, I suspect my child is autistic. Or I've had parents say, my child has come to me and said, I think I'm autistic. How important is that diagnosis? And then what should come after that? I think that's a really important piece. It's not just about, yes, you have autism, or yes, you're autistic, and then now they know. There has to be something else after, some follow-up or follow-through.
The knowing is like, cool, now what?
Right, exactly.
In the assessment world, no, that's not the purpose of assessment.
Absolutely not.
So it's an individual thing. So for some people, they find that all the resources that are out there on the internet, they feel that they can sort of self-diagnose. And that feels comfortable to them. They adopt the label. They get involved with these, neurodivergent communities and feel great. And that's enough. For others, especially minors, I would say a more formal diagnosis can be helpful to make sure there is a connection between that diagnosis and getting things like social skills intervention, being a part of a group where we practice these things, going out in the community with a group. So there's more structure, I think, that can happen following a formal diagnosis, if that makes sense. So, but it really just depends on the person. I've also met kids who are like, I could be neurodivergent, I don't care. Like, more power to you, But then there's others really struggling with the difficulties associated with autism that it would make sense. Like, let's really get a closer look at what you're, shining at and what the things that you're struggling with. And so then we can connect you with, this person works on, let's say, body-based interventions when you have anxiety in social situations. So that way it can be a little bit more individualized.
Yeah, that makes sense, because everyone is going to respond differently. And for many, I see that there's almost this validation and this relief. Okay, now I understand why this is so hard. Oh, this is what I've been doing, the camouflaging. Oh, other people don't do that. And they realize that that's their way of compensating. So I think that learning piece, that psychoeducation piece, is so important for the individual and for the family.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, even in the older adults that I've assessed, they'll say like, oh man, because we do a very thorough interview of like, tell me all about the developmental milestones. Tell me about what it was like making friends when you were really little. And all of that does feel like it's contained. It explains things, it validates, and that's very, very powerful for people to have that sense of, okay, I wasn't just making this up. There was a reason why all of these things happened. Can be very helpful.
Right. And I feel like it's a step closer to self-acceptance when you have that self-awareness and that understanding of self. And then they have the decision of whether or not, and this, a lot of times this depends on the age of the individual, whether to share that information and how they want to share that information. And I think that is powerful as well.
Right. Absolutely. Because then it becomes yours to own. Some folks will say, I don't want anybody to know about this. That's how I stay in my power, is by making this is just for me. Other people will say like, oh, now I can talk to my partner about this, or now we can, move through this in a different way. It can be powerful whether you choose to share or not.
So any final thoughts for parents who suspect, their daughter is autistic, or like I said, a parent whose child is saying, I think I'm autistic? What should some first steps or first conversations look like? Would you recommend?
Yes, between parent and child. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, creating, for parents in general to have this safe, nurturing space where whatever you're going through, whatever you feel, whatever you think, I am here and I'm with you. And I'm not trying to problem solve. I think that's an important piece. Like, I'm really here to listen and I'm a container. So having this sort of, I don't know, it's like benevolence, right? Like, I'm here and I'm holding the space to sort of set the stage that way, because then you can have dialogue. Then there can be, okay, there's a sense of safety that we're not trying to do anything. They're not trying to take me to a specialist. We're just having a conversation about how are things going with your friends? I've noticed that, I haven't been taking you to many hangouts, or you came home that weekend that you went to Big Bear with your friends. What was going on? So gently asking, inquiring in a way that doesn't feel problem solving oriented and doesn't feel pathologizing, right? There's not something wrong with you. We want to convey, we're trying to help and trying to figure out what you're struggling with as it relates to your interactions and your relationships. And then just to have an eye out for like this other category that we've mentioned, the rigidities, the sensory component. So having sensory sensitivities, and that kind of cluster of symptoms, just be looking out for those. I think is a nice way to start.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that is just perfect. I think that gives parents perfect guidance in terms of next steps if they're thinking about this and wondering about this. And if parents want to have a follow-up conversation with you or get in touch with you about possible assessment or consultation, what is the best way for them to reach you?
Yeah, so our practice is called Spectrum Psych LA. So we have a website called Spectrum Psych, and that's Spectrum, like autism spectrum, PSYCHLA.com. So
Wonderful.
We do free consultations, all sorts of things to just get the conversation started if that's something folks are, have concerns about.
Wonderful. And I will be sure to put a link in the show notes. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Beardmore. I love having these conversations with you and collaborating with you and helping these kiddos and these families have a better understanding of their challenges, but also their strengths and the unique contributions that they bring to the world. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Yes, it's a very important topic to bring to light. So thank you again for having me.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.